Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. President Moon Jae-in, as we've been hearing, is in Australia on a 4-day state visit to that country. On Monday, he had the summit with the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. South Korean officials say the main focus of the South Korean leader's trip is to deepen South Korea's already strong ties with Australia and to secure a stable supply of raw materials and core minerals.
And for more, we're joined by Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London. Good morning to you, Professor. Now, the two countries, with Australia, between Australia and South Korea, we've had a solid and symbolic relationship. Can you explain what South Korea offers Australia and, in reverse, what Australia offers South Korea in terms of economic benefits?
Well, first of all, if we look at the Korean side, it sells oil products to Australia, also cars, electric batteries, and a host of high-tech products that Korean companies produce and that Australian companies and consumers want to buy. And I think on the Australian side, obviously, the main exports are minerals and other products that Korean companies would use in the production of the goods that they need to produce. And as your reporter was saying, Korea wants to diversify away from over-reliance from China. So that's very important for the Korean side. Plus, of course, we shouldn't forget food products from Australia, like Australian wine, which is very popular in Korea.
Yeah, everyone loves a bit of Australian wine, and the beef's pretty good too. During his press conference with Morrison, President Moon stated, I think for the first time publicly, that South Korea is not going to follow countries like the US, the UK and Canada in imposing a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. Now, what factors do you think influence Seoul's position on this matter?
I think the diplomatic boycott is a bit of a straw man. For a while, we thought that there could be a sports boycott. This is not going to happen. So now some countries are moving into a diplomatic boycott. On the Korean side, I don't think it makes much sense to join the boycott for a couple of reasons, a couple of them mentioned by President Moon already. The North Korean issue, the strong economic partnership, but also we shouldn't forget Korea and China are of course neighbors, and China didn't engage in any sort of diplomatic boycott of the Pyeongchang Olympics, the last Winter Olympics. So from a Korean perspective, I don't think it makes political sense or economic sense to join this boycott, which in any case is fairly symbolic. We're going to see sports people from the US, from Australia, Canada, the UK participating at the Olympics. Probably no leaders of these countries are going to go to China anyway because of the pandemic. So in a sense, the boycott, I don't think is going to have much of a practical effect. It is, of course, a political message, but in practical terms, I don't think it is going to make much of a difference to China.
Well, President Moon was also keen to stress that his visit to Australia had nothing to do with the administration's position on China, and his wariness, of course, is understandable given Beijing's rather angry reaction to the recent security pact established between Australia, the US and the UK. Why does this security pact, AUKUS, have Beijing so riled up?
Well, I think the main reason is that it introduced a new system, arms system into the Indo-Pacific region, which is, of course, nuclear-powered submarines. And this gives a considerable advantage to the Australian Navy vis-a-vis China, because very few countries in the world actually have this technology. Essentially, it's the US, the UK, and now in the future it will be Australia. And I think it's also another sign that countries in the region are cooperating with each other to try to contain China. Of course, President Moon would say that the visit has nothing to do with China, but Korea and Australia have signed a cybersecurity agreement. Hanwha, the Korean company, is selling artillery to Australia. So clearly, there is a China component to his visit, and AUKUS is part of these alliances being created across the region, sometimes including Korea, which to an extent are trying to contain China when we focus on security matters.
Yeah, you shouldn't imagine Beijing are very happy about South Korea selling artillery and weaponry to Australia, but we'll see if they react to that. But Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison said he welcomes South Korea's decision to join, or start the process anyway, of joining this comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as CPTPP. How does South Korea stand to benefit from joining this all-encompassing FTA that spans much of the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think it stands to benefit in three ways. First of all, this is a much more comprehensive agreement than, for example, RCEP, which is entering into force in a few weeks' time. It covers services, it covers digital trade. So for Korea, it would allow it to trade in more beneficial terms with the members of the CPTPP in areas in which it doesn't have necessarily agreements with them. Secondly, it is an agreement that includes Japan, and of course Korea and Japan are going to be part of RCEP, but I think Korean companies now compete on an equal footing with Japanese companies. So at the bilateral level, this should increase trade between both, but also, of course, both of them compete in areas such as Southeast Asia as well. And I think this would give Korean companies, it would allow them to compete on equal footing. And finally, we shouldn't forget that there are Latin American countries that are part of the agreement. And even though Korea has agreements with some of them, it doesn't have one with Mexico, which is an increasingly important partner for Korean companies. So it could strengthen links, or it would strengthen links between Korea and the other side of the Pacific, the Latin American countries on the other side of the Pacific Ocean.
Well, thank you very much for your insights. That was Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, on President Moon's state visit to Australia.
Thanks for having me.